Hello and welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. Happy Thanksgiving to you and to your family, and I hope you have a chance to sit down, make some memories together, eat a delicious meal, and just have a great time celebrating all of the blessings that we've received from God with your friends, your family, your loved ones. I know not everyone is going to be able to watch live this week, and that's okay. That's why we don't just post it live, but it stays available in our app, on our website forever, basically. So if you know someone who wanted to watch and couldn't watch it live, just let them know it's available to watch anytime. Right after your Thanksgiving meal, you can bust out your phone and say, "And now for a Bible study with my pastor." That would totally be fine. You can do that. Tonight we're continuing our study of the book of Philippians, and we're in Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through verse 18. A great passage, really encouraging, really challenging, and it's primarily about thinking about God's blessings, everything He's done for us, and how we can put those into practice in our relationships with other people. So let's begin. Let's just dive right in. Philippians chapter 2, starting verses 1 through 4. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any comfort from His love, any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness or compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interest of others. Now, wow, what a challenging passage already, but it goes like this. Paul is reminding this congregation, the church in the city of Philippi, of all of the incredible blessings that we have through our relationship with Christ. You can read these. He says, if you have encouragement, if you have comfort, if you have common sharing, which is the Greek word koinonia, fellowship with the Spirit, any tenderness, any compassion. And he's saying that as an if, like if you have these things, but in Paul's mind, he knows that they do. Paul knows that when we have a relationship with God, we will experience all of these tremendous blessings that come from God, that come from Jesus. And if we have those things, then there's sort of a responsibility to demonstrate them in our relationships with other people. And Paul says it this way: if you have all of these blessings, make my joy complete by paying those blessings forward. Now, in Philippians chapter 1, verse 4, Paul says that every time he prays for this church, the church in Philippi, he prays with joy because of the partnership, the koinonia in the gospel that they've experienced. They have a long history together, and Paul uses some very affectionate language to describe his friendship, his relationship with this particular congregation. He doesn't talk that way about every church he writes to. And in fact, you can read another letter from Paul, the letter of Galatians, and I'm pretty sure he calls them, "You foolish Galatians." So he doesn't have this same kind of really positive, language towards all of the churches he's writing to. The Philippian church is really special towards him. And he says, every time I think about you, I pray with joy because we have been partners in the preaching of the gospel. They've been through a lot. They have shared experiences, and Paul is really positive towards them. At the same time, here in chapter 2, he says, make my joy complete. And he's using a word that describes filling up a cup. So we can picture that Paul has a cup, and maybe on the cup is the word joy. It's already super full because of the ongoing relationship he has with this congregation and their history together, everything that they've done so far. man, my cup is just, really, really full because of everything we've been through. But then he says, make my joy complete. Fill my cup even more. Let's fill this thing to the top so that it overflows. So there's still work to be done. And for Paul, in order to get that cup of joy all the way full and overflowing, Paul says, start to live out those blessings you've received from God in your relationships with other people. So let's take what we've been given, this undeserved gift of grace, all of this encouragement and comfort and fellowship and tenderness and compassion, and do those things. Live that way in your relationships with other people. And it focuses so much on humility, putting others first. Not only caring about what you need or what's best for you, but having a willingness to put other people first. And if the Philippian church is willing to do that, to put others first, then Paul's cup of joy is going to be full and it's going to be overflowing. The next few verses here, Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, is this wonderful early Christian hymn or poem, which is why in your Bible it's formatted a little differently and it looks almost like song lyrics or something like that. It looks like maybe something from the book of Psalms or Ecclesiastes, these books of poetry in the Bible. And a lot of people think this is an early Christian hymn that Paul is quoting or reminding the church of because it's so, it fits in so well with the point that he's making. Now, not too long ago, I guess it was maybe about a month ago now in October, I talked about this particular passage, Philippians 2 verses 5 through 11. It makes so much sense in light of what we've been talking about so far of humility and putting other people first. Paul is already saying, think of what God has done for you with the comfort and encouragement and love and do that for others. And 5 through 11 is an in-depth discussion of everything Jesus did for us, giving up all of his rights and privileges and all the things that he had going for him. He gave it all up so that he could come and be with us and suffer for us and die for us so that we could receive a blessing. So he says, look, you've received great things from God, pay them forward. Just like Jesus gave up everything to be a blessing to us, that's kind of the example that we need to follow. Now, since I just did an entire class on this passage, I'm not going to say really anything more about it. But if you are new to our classes and are joining us for Philippians and didn't get a chance to hear my earlier class on Philippians, you can find it in the Westside Bakersfield app, which is free in your app stores. You can also find it on westsidelife.org/media, and all of our classes and sermons are organized into the series they're part of. So this one was in the Cross series. It was from October 13th, and that class is called The God of Self-Sacrificing Love. So if you wanted to hear a little bit more about that, you can find it there. Let's keep reading now in verse 12. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Now this passage right here, especially verse 12, when it talks about working out your salvation with fear and with trembling, I think this has caused a lot of Christians a lot of unnecessary guilt and heartache and maybe even heartburn, like a lot of insecurity, because those words fear and trembling call to mind this insecurity or this worry or this paralyzing panic that I'm not sure if I have a tight enough grip on my salvation. And I think it's caused a lot of Christians to view their salvation as something that they barely have a grasp on, that their grip of it is so precarious, so fragile, that even the slightest slip up, the smallest mistake that we make in our relationship with God would cause it to slip out of our grip, and we might lose our salvation the very first time that we sin or mess up or something like that. And that way of thinking, or that interpretation of this passage, would cause anyone to have a lot of panic, a lot of anxiety, like chronic spiritual anxiety. You would probably feel like you're constantly walking on eggshells, and the very first moment you mess up, God is going to zap you with his, lightning bolts the way Zeus would in Greek mythology and take away your salvation because it's so dependent on getting everything right all the time. That way of thinking doesn't leave a lot of room for God's grace, does it? And I understand why that line of thinking has been popular, and I can kind of see where it comes from in the scriptures, because it does use the word fear and it does use the word trembling. It's talking about working hard to work out our salvation, to cause it to happen, to bring it about as a result. That's kind of what that word means. But I think this is sort of misunderstood. And here's my reason for saying that. The word fear in the Bible is one that gets misunderstood a lot, because in the Greek language of the New Testament, there's this one word, phobos, like phobia, it has a lot of different nuances to it. It's not a one-dimensional word. There's a wide range of things that it could mean depending on the context. Now, in English, we have separate words for all of those different flavors or slight variations of what that word could mean. In English, we have not only the word fear, but also the word respect, or awe, or alarm, or reverence, or fright, or intimidation, which are all possible meanings of that one Greek word phobia that are in my really fancy, Greek, English lexicons of the New Testament, basically my Greek dictionaries. There's a lot of different possibilities there, but they all go back to the same root word for phobos or phobia. And the way that you figure out, well, does it mean fear? Or does it mean respect? Or does it mean awe or panic or intimidation? How do we know which one? You don't just kind of roll the dice and, get translate it whatever the dice comes up as. It's not random chance. The best way to figure it out is to read the context of the passage. And sometimes Bible translators, they love the Lord, they know the Greek language inside and out, and yet there's still judgment calls that need to be made, and they read it in context, and they try and put down their best interpretation of what that word means in context. Sometimes it's super clear, and sometimes it's like 50-50, and it's not exactly real clear which of those slight variations someone like Paul would have meant. So there's a bit of a judgment call there. I'm not saying they got it wrong. I'm not saying that they're, they don't love the Lord or they're doing bad work. I'm just saying sometimes there's a judgment call here. And a lot of the translations use the word fear, but some of them also use the word awe or deep reverence. And those are some other possible translations or understandings of what that word means. So what is Paul really saying? Is he saying we need to work out our salvation with fear? Like there's something we need to be afraid of or worried about? Or is it awe? Is it a deep reverence or a respect? Let me tell you what I think is happening in this passage. And I think there's a really important clue here that helps us understand what Paul's talking about. The clue is that Paul doesn't say, work out your salvation with fear by itself. It's not fear as the only word there. It is fear and trembling. And as it happens, Paul is the only person in the New Testament to pair those two words together, fear and trembling. He uses it as a phrase 4 times in the Bible. And if we want to understand what Paul had in mind when he wrote down, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, one of the things that we can do is look at the other places in the Bible where he uses this same phrase, because that'll tell us what was happening in that situation and help us understand what it means in context. So when you do look at those 3 other passages in addition to Philippians 2, where Paul talks about fear and trembling, the most consistent theme among all 4 passages is humility and sincerity. So when Paul says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, I'm hearing him say, work out your salvation with humility, with sincerity, taking an honest look at your spiritual health, not automatically assuming that you're doing everything right and obviously you're a perfect Christian and God just approves of everything you do, but it's looking at your own spiritual health with honesty, with humility, with sincerity. And let me just tell you what those other passages were so you can look them up and read those in context and see where I'm getting that from. One of them is 1 Corinthians chapter 2, and the phrase is used in verse 3. I came to you in weakness, with great fear and trembling. Paul is talking about when he came to preach the gospel to the Corinthians. And he specifically said, I didn't come with the most eloquent words or carefully memorized speeches. I didn't come using all these SAT words and the latest and greatest philosophies of the day. All I came to you with was the simple message of the cross. I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. And in verse 4 in that passage, my message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. He's saying, I came to you with humility, with authenticity, with sincerity. I wasn't trying to make it all about me. I was just trying to simply present the gospel message. That's one passage. Another one is 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, where it, and really the context would be verses 13 through 16. Paul is talking about how the church received Titus, this Christian preacher, this missionary that Paul had sent to the Corinthian church. And the phrase here is used to describe the Corinthians' attitude towards Titus when he showed up. So I'll read that one in context. In addition to our own encouragement, we were especially delighted to see how happy Titus was, because his spirit has been refreshed by all of you. I had boasted to him about you, and you have not embarrassed me. But just as everything we said to you was true, so our boasting about you to Titus has proved to be true as well. And his affection for you is all the greater when he remembers that you were all obedient, receiving him with fear and trembling. I am glad I can have complete confidence in you. And there it's talking about how they were gracious hosts to Titus. They were willing to listen. They were obedient to the message. They received him and the message with humility and sincerity. It would be so odd for Titus to be so happy and so delighted about the fact that the Corinthians were absolutely terrified of him, that they were so filled with panic that they were paralyzed just seeing him. If this phrase fear and trembling meant that kind of worry and panic and anxiety, why would Titus be excited about that at all? It makes so much more sense to see it as humility, authenticity, and sincerity. They were gracious hosts, opened their lives to him, opened their homes to him, maybe opened their hearts to him and the message. And so what we see here is, again, this theme of humility. The next place it's used is Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 8, which is part of the household codes that Paul is writing about. And he's talking about husbands, wives, kids, slaves. He'll do this, and others will do this in the New Testament too, to talk about what life in the home should be like for disciples of Jesus. He uses it in talking about slaves. Ephesians 6, starting in verse 5, slaves, obey your earthly matters with respect and fear. And although it doesn't say fear and trembling in the English translation in the NIV, it is the exact same phrase in the Greek language. Here, they just translate it respect and fear instead of fear and trembling for some reason. So they change it there. Again, they're going off of context and feeling like in that context, that's the best translation. Anyway, it does say literally fear and trembling just like the other three passages, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eyes on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. Again, there, Paul is talking to these slaves and saying, understand that you're not just serving that earthly master, but you're serving the Lord, and understand that your service towards them is something that you're doing for God himself. So in all three of those passages, in addition to Philippians 2, I'm seeing this theme of humility, of sincerity, of being open in your heart, of being honest, but I'm not necessarily seeing everyone needs to panic and you need to walk on eggshells all the time, and boy, you better be super worried and super concerned about everything you do. Paul is not trying to elevate their anxiety. He is saying, take an honest look in the mirror. Be humble about your own spiritual health. Be honest. Be sincere in the way that you're evaluating yourselves. And another reason why I don't think he's saying, you need to worry, you need to be extra concerned, you need to be like paralyzed. I don't think he's saying that, because in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, he says, don't be anxious about anything. But when you do, pray about it, and God will, ease your fears and ease your anxiety. So I don't get the sense that Paul wants the church to be constantly worried, constantly stressed, constantly doubting their own relationship with God, because he speaks so much about God's grace and how he lavishes that grace on us. But I do hear him saying, take an honest look in the mirror. Be honest about your spiritual health, and perhaps have a healthy fear of some of the things that can derail our relationship with God. We teach, our kids to have a healthy fear of things that can harm them. Don't put a fork in that socket in the wall, because that can really harm you. Don't run out into the street because there's cars there that can harm you. I don't want my kids to constantly feel anxious and stressed about the world that they live in, but I do want them to have a healthy fear of the things that can harm them. So I think that there is room here to understand fear and trembling as a healthy fear of some of the things that can harm our spiritual health, but I don't think it is constantly walk on eggshells, because the moment that you mess up, God is going to zap you and take away the salvation that he's given you. One other point that I'd like to make about this word fear is to compare and contrast with something that Paul said in chapter 1. So in chapter 1, I think it's verse 14, Paul says that one of the benefits or the blessings of him being in prison is that there's other Christians out there who are emboldened by his sacrifice. And they are willing to go preach the gospel without fear because they look at Paul's example. So that's a really good thing. And Paul says, look, we shouldn't be afraid of preaching the gospel because God is with us. We have God. And hey, worst case scenario, if we are killed because of the faith, we get our reward. We get to go be with God in heaven. And that's honestly the best thing that we could experience. So don't worry about what might happen to you when you're preaching the gospel. At the same time, he tells us to have a healthy fear with respect to our own relationship with God, and to be mindful of the things that can harm our spiritual standing with the Lord. So don't worry about external things that can harm your body, but have a healthy fear of some of the roadblocks and obstacles and things that can derail your spiritual health. And that reminds me a lot of what Jesus says in Luke chapter 12, verses 4 through 5. And he says, don't fear the person who can harm only your earthly body, but fear the one who can harm your eternal soul. Just be mindful of the temporary versus the eternal. So don't fear the consequences to our temporary bodies, but have a healthy respect, a healthy fear of some of those things that can harm our eternal souls instead. All right, so let's keep reading here. We'll finish out the passage, verses 14 through 18. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. I love that passage as a parent, but I hated it as a kid because I always had to be reminded, hey, no complaining, no arguing. All right, do everything without grumbling or arguing so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. So we are called to have a really humble, flexible, positive attitude. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. Not everything that we're called to do in this life is going to be fun. there's difficult things. There's things you do just because you have to do it, like flossing or going to the dentist, right? You just got to do some of these things. Paul is saying you're going to have things that come across your desk, that come across your plate, that you're just called to do. They're not going to be the most enjoyable. You are not legally required to loudly complain about the difficult things in your life. In fact, maybe we can do those with a positive attitude and just do them anyway without the grumbling and the arguing. And he says if we do that, we're really going to stand out against the culture that is so focused on ourselves that when people act selflessly, it immediately sets us apart. So if we can do everything without grumbling or arguing, we will be blameless and we will be pure, and we're really going to stand out against the culture that is doing everything with the focus on them or yourself. And when we act that way, we'll kind of be this bright beacon of light, this light that's all about hope, that's all about joy, that's all about love in an otherwise dark world. And that'll give us the opportunity to show the world a different path, to point people to Jesus, to point people to a way of life that's focused on love and joy and hope, instead of just this endless pursuit of self-gratification and getting what I need for my life so I can be happy. If we're willing to put others first, to do things without grumbling or complaining, we're going to shine like stars in the dark world. I love that. I love that image. And then he says, but even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering, like even if I'm on this, like on an altar, I'm getting poured out, I'm sacrificing everything, we can still rejoice. And he kind of says, if you guys hold firmly, right? Like as you hold firmly to the word of life. Paul is saying, look, we've been through a lot together, Philippian church, like we've been there for one another. You've sacrificed for me. I've sacrificed for you. We've been through a lot. I've preached to you. I want you to hold on to that. And I don't want to get to the very end of my life or your guys' life and find out that you've walked away from the faith. Like I've worked so hard to pour into you guys. I don't want you to lose it all at the very end. So he's encouraging them to stand strong in the faith, to not give up even when it gets difficult, and despite everything that might be happening, all of the struggles or obstacles that they're facing, there's still reasons to rejoice. We still have a relationship with Christ, and he wants them to know he still loves them and he's proud of them, and there are opportunities to find joy even in the difficult moments. So that's Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. As far as what do we do with this passage? How do we actually apply it? There's maybe 3 things that stood out to me. One is that Paul talks a lot about heart and character in this passage. What happens in our inner life is very important, and maybe it's just as important as what we actually do, like how we actually treat people. So there's a lot here about developing the heart of Christ, the mindset that Jesus had, basically our inner life. So your heart and your character matter just as much as your conduct. Another thing that stood out to me is that sharing is caring. Right? Like sharing shows how much you love others. So you can maybe start praying about the ways that you can pay God's blessings forward. This goes back to those opening lines from this chapter about if you've received, this encouragement and comfort and tenderness and compassion, then be like-minded and pay those blessings forward in your relationships. So everything good that God has done for you, don't be the recipient of that, be a recipient and a giver of those same things. So don't be just a recipient, but receive it and then pay it forward to others as well. And then lastly, going back to the fear and trembling, right? We need to be concerned, we be thinking about our spiritual health, but it's not panic, it's not paralyzing anxiety, it's not a debilitating fear. It is maybe an honest look at the health of our spiritual life. So don't panic about your salvation, but don't assume it's perfect when maybe it's not. Be willing to take a tough look at the things in your life that could possibly derail your relationship with God. So that's our class for tonight. I really appreciate you spending some time with me. And like I said, whether it's live on Wednesday night, the day before Thanksgiving, or maybe you're watching later on. Happy December to all of you, people who are watching in the future. It's great to have you, but we really just appreciate the chance to connect with you, to study with you. Thank you for tuning in and watching with us. Have a fantastic Thanksgiving. Have a great week, and we hope to see you guys really soon here